Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to look at conservation and sustainability for your A-level biology. Now there's lots and lots of detail involved in this video, and to make sure that you've got all the detail correct in your head and that you can remember everything, that you've practiced retrieving everything for your exam, Dr. Edwards has written set retrieval practice questions just for you over on the website.
Conservation and preservation of ecosystems. Okay, so first we're going to look at the definitions and the differences between conservation and preservation. So conservation is maintaining or improving biodiversity by maintaining habitats and ecosystems. It often involves human intervention to actively manage an area of habitat. It works to maintain species diversity, so the number of different species in an area, but also the genetic diversity within species, so trying to prevent a species in itself from becoming, say, inbred or fragmented and have low genetic diversity. Preservation is about preserving species and habitats as they currently are, so kind of just not necessarily improving them or maintaining them in any way, but just leaving them as they are as natural habitats and stopping any human activity that could then disrupt the natural environment. This could even include preventing the sustainable use of resources on the land, so preventing logging, fishing, or farming even if it was just like grazing of cattle, because that would be changing the landscape or having a human interaction with the landscape that wouldn't be there otherwise. The issues with preservation are that few habitats in the world are actually natural anymore because there's been so much human activity and intervention and changing of those landscapes. So that's part of the problem, is that actually you're not preserving what would be a natural landscape because it has already been changed by humans. But also the idea that if you prevent any human activity in an area, this could cause conflicts with local people and local communities, and that's something that we're going to try and have to avoid if we want to try and make sure that we're actually helping biodiversity. The other reason for kind of conservation over preservation is that natural ecosystems are dynamic. We've said that they can change, and think of things like succession, which is a natural change over time. That's going to happen without human intervention anyway, and actually succession happening might change an environment to a point where it might actually make it not suitable for a certain species. So even just saying no human intervention is better isn't necessarily true, because there might need to be some human intervention to try and actually manage and help prevent any species from going extinct further. Let's look at some examples of strategies and management processes. So for a lot of conservation efforts to succeed, it's really important to involve and communicate with the local community, and sometimes that might also involve educating the local community about what you're doing. Sometimes, in order to help improve biodiversity, you might need to help raise the carrying capacity of a specific habitat, and this could be by providing extra food, for example. In order to increase numbers in a population, this could also be to help prevent reduction in genetic diversity. You can move individuals together to form a larger population, or connect fragmented populations using things like diversity corridors to allow them to actually go between different fragmented habitats in order to kind of mate and obviously bring up the general numbers of the population. You can reduce the effect of poaching or increases in predator numbers on biodiversity by helping to control those predator numbers. This could be through a process of culling, so killing certain predators to reduce their numbers, or obviously to try and prevent illegal poaching from humans. Using fences to control movement, so preventing animals from leaving a certain area in case they might get killed by humans or interact with humans, or to prevent them from dispersing, so to stop them from spreading out too far and then not being able to come back together. Vaccinating populations, obviously this is a human intervention, but it can reduce the effects of disease or stop disease spreading through populations. You can preserve habitat, so this is not necessarily just about conservation, but also there is a role that preservation has to play, so preventing pollution, so stopping human impact to prevent pollution of a certain habitat, or by deflecting succession. So if you want to preserve a habitat as it currently is, stopping and preventing succession is one way of doing that. Removing invasive species. So invasive species are obviously really detrimental to some ecosystems. So if you remove them and then either replace or recolonise those populations with native populations that should be there. All of these and which one is going to be used and what's going to be used in order to manage an ecosystem will depend on an analysis of that ecosystem to find out what the major problems are, what's causing some of the impacts, and therefore deciding what is best in each case. Some reasons for conservation that have to be considered. Firstly, economic. We've looked at some of these already and they haven't really changed from when we discussed why we should maintain and conserve biodiversity before. But the economic reasons often include things like ecotourism, so the various habitats and unique locations will bring in tourists to visit the area to look at wild populations, and that is obviously a large source of income for some countries. There are also recreation activities within these ecosystems can also bring in money. The financial impact of food security, so the fact that obviously a lot of trade and other things is reliant on this ability to grow and sell crops and food resources, and if we don't have that, so if biodiversity reduction actually causes a drop in food resources, then that can have a financial impact. The economic importance of other trade resources, so things like timber, cotton, medicines, loads of different other resources are and can be very important for trade for countries. So if biodiversity impacts those, then that can obviously be a financial burden. And then stability of ecosystems. So both of those two things we've just looked at, so the food security idea and then the resources idea. If we don't have stable ecosystems that are functioning naturally with the idea of cycling of nutrients and things like that, then that's going to have an impact on those resources directly, which then can have a financial impact. Some social reasons as well. So obviously the populations of humans, and this could be local populations up to the global population, rely on ecosystems to live. So we need the food and we need the medicine in order to survive and carry on living our lives. So if that were to happen, that would have an impact on human life all over the world. Also the natural spaces, so like we said for ecotourism recreation, the natural spaces are also important for mental and physical well-being. So not just going to somewhere specific on a holiday, but being able to go out in the natural world locally where you live is really important. Obviously, there are also ethical reasons why we should make sure we protect and conserve ecosystems. Every species has value, and we as humans have a duty to protect ecosystems and habitats to try and prevent extinction of species. We also have a moral duty to preserve our ecosystems for future generations so that they can obviously experience them as well. So thinking about these three reasons overall, while it can seem like obviously the ethical reasons are the most important, governments and people in charge of a lot of the laws, legislation and the actual kind of methods to be able to actually help do and carry out this conservation on large scales are more likely to respond to the financial and economic reasons. So let's have a think about sustainability then. So why is the human impact causing such issues with ecosystems and biodiversity? And it's because the human population is increasing exponentially. We're using more and more intense methods to try and extract more resources from the natural environment in order to do things like feed the growing population, have building materials for a growing population to build more houses because we need more spaces to live in. So because of this sort of time between massive population increase and therefore massive resource extraction required, many cases our resource use is unsustainable. This means that we risk using it all before it can be replaced. So we are extracting things from the land, from the ocean, faster than they could be replaced. So if we want to comply with some of those kind of social, ethical, financial reasons, we need to make sure that we have resources for the future generations and also to try and reduce our impact on biodiversity. And in order to do that, our practices and the way we extract some of these resources needs to be more sustainable. We're going to look at two examples with fisheries and timber production as to how these are being made more sustainable. So first up, we're going to look at sustainable timber production. This is obviously the production of wood from trees, which we need for various different uses. So it could be for burning for firewood, for fuel, it could be for making paper, it could be for building materials, it could be for using to like fencing and furniture and loads of other things. So this is kind of how we can sustainably manage forests that we currently use to extract wood. So one of the first kind of sustainable ways of managing and producing timber is through coppicing and pollarding. Coppicing is where we cut trees down to stumps, so obviously that large bit of the wood would then be used, but then instead of taking out the whole tree, we cut down to a stump, and then the stump can regrow new stems. So these will be kind of thin, more kind of twig-like, that will kind of grow and get a bit thicker, but they won't be sort of the whole thickness of a tree trunk. But every time that those are removed, more will grow. So this is a kind of sustainable way of kind of regrowing wood in a short-term method that can then give us sort of small pieces of wood for firewood, fencing and furniture. So it's not big building materials, but it's a way of getting wood for those purposes. Pollarding is slightly different, but only really that you cut higher up. Instead of producing a stump, you kind of cut halfway up the trunk, and this means that the shoots that are growing out will be protected from deer because they'll be too high up for the deer to eat. Also, with coppicing and pollarding, you can rotate this in sections, so you wouldn't coppice or pollard a whole forest in one go. You would do it in sections and rotate to help increase biodiversity. So you remove, obviously, cut down trees to a stump in one section, let them regrow before you do the next one, and then you would rotate, so you would always have sections that were fully grown to increase that biodiverse habitat. There's a range of habitats throughout the forest. In large forests, if you need large trees and larger pieces of wood, obviously for building materials and other things, you're going to have to use slightly different methods. Planting native trees is important, as obviously then you've got a natural species and you're maintaining a natural ecosystem that would normally be there, and also they tend to grow better in that natural environment. Only cutting the oldest and most valuable trees and obviously letting younger ones grow to a certain decent size before removing them. Spacing trees far apart to reduce their competition for light and nutrients. Again, this is to make sure that they grow well. Any harvested tree must be replaced with at least one new tree. Harvesting in small sections to allow the forest to regrow. So again, like we said with the coppicing, you wouldn't harvest a whole forest and get rid of a whole massive set of trees in one go. You do it in sort of strips or sections to make sure that there was still a large amount of taller trees and forest there to preserve the habitat, and that maintains the ecological functions of the forest in order for it to be able to nutrient cycle, prevent flooding and soil erosion and things like that, and then also to provide that habitat there for most of the time in the majority of the space for other species. And as we said, involve local people so they can benefit from the forest, either through protecting and helping to manage it, or they're benefiting financially in some way, or getting some materials from the forest, as long as local people are involved and they know how the process is being managed. When you're planting new trees as well, especially if you're planting saplings or small trees, using guards to protect them from deer is another important step. Managing fish stocks sustainably. There are three main ways this can be done. The first is to avoid overfishing. This is so that fish populations are maintained at the carrying capacity of the environment, so that only fish harvested are in excess of that carrying capacity. This prevents populations from decreasing. This is normally achieved through fishing quotas, which is set amounts that certain countries or areas are allowed to fish to make sure that we don't overexploit and harvest too many and so the population decreases too much. There are also size regulations for the size of fish that can be caught or the size of the holes in the nets used in order to make sure that small fish are returned and allows the chance to grow and breed before being harvested. Another important part of this is that no destructive methods should be used when fishing that could damage the habitat. This is so that other dependent species are not affected as well. So for example, bottom trawling, where they used to drag really big heavy bars along the bottom of the seabed, used to damage it and damage coral reefs and things like that. Or actually at one point there was the use of certain explosives, and these could obviously kill and damage large parts of the habitat. And finally, raising fish in aquaculture or fish farming. This can help to supply a source of sustainable fish, but it reduces the impact on the natural populations. This actually could be a really large proportion of how fish are sourced in the future, and it could become a solution for actually feeding a larger number of people by obviously fencing off certain areas, being able to create certain areas of aquatic environments, so whether it's freshwater or saltwater environments, and then feeding the fish specifically to grow them and then harvest them on a rotation that we would use obviously from fish populations that are enclosed and farmed and not using natural populations. There's a few ethical concerns around how this will be done, and in some cases they obviously have to require to conform to a certain number of regulations and rules, but obviously it could provide a really sustainable source of fish for future populations.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I explain scratches.